This is chapter 27, section 3 of the reading in your packet. And so it was over America's course or curse of empire, and then perplexities in Puerto Rico and Cuba. So jumping right in with the conclusion of the Spanish-American War in August of 1898, peace negotiations took place between the United States and Spain in Paris. And so the agreement that was reached at the conclusion of these negotiations was called the Treaty of Paris. And we'll have a couple of Treaty of Parises as we go through this class. And so what was laid out in the Treaty of Paris was that Cuba was going to be free and independent, as was dictated by the Teller Amendment. And if you remember, the Teller Amendment is what was passed when the declaration of war took place. So when the U.S. Congress declared war on Spain, they included a Teller Amendment saying when the war was concluded and Spain was out, that Cuba would be free. And so the United States does adhere to this in the Treaty of Paris. However, there are stipulations, which we'll look at here in a couple of slides. Also with the Treaty of Paris, the United States gains territories. So we gain Puerto Rico, Guam, and then control of the Philippines. And we'll talk about two of those with a little bit more detail. The Philippines of the new treaty posed the biggest problem because we weren't sure exactly how to handle them. The Philippines was different than the other territories we gained, and anything we'd ever added to the U.S. beforehand, because the Philippines was a heavily populated area. I think your textbook said it had over 7 million people. Very different than in terms of background and culture than anything the United States had assumed control of. And by involving themselves in the Philippines, the United States was now involving itself in the East Asian sphere of influence. So this is all kind of new ground, and they're not sure what to do. And so the textbook outlines 3 different options. One is to simply give back the Philippines to Spain, which doesn't make much sense because the Philippines have been misrun by Spain for decades before, and we just got the Philippines from Spain, so that would make sense. There were some thoughts of letting the Filipino people run their own country, but the fear was that rival warlords within the country would start a civil war. So when you have removal of power, then you have groups fighting over power, and that would result in chaos for the Philippines. And so the third option, and ultimately is what President McKinley chooses to do, is the United States is going to take over the Philippines. Downsides of this is the United States is going to look like an imperial bully. We're essentially just replacing Spain with the U.S. And for that reason, the Filipino people don't want the U.S. there. They want to be free and independent. And we'll talk about later in this class, they eventually do get that, but it is not for 45 plus years. And so with this, you have 2 different camps emerge, and we talked about this. The first content-based class that we had, this battle between imperialist and anti-imperialist will be a theme throughout the time frame we'll talk about in the United States, and even still today. I don't hear it referred to as imperialism versus not imperialist or anti-imperialist, but whether or not the United States should focus on the U.S. or the world stage is often still debated in modern day politics. So on the side of the anti-imperialist, they want to halt this annexation of the Philippines. They say this is different for the reasons I outlined than any other U.S. territorial expansion like Alaska or even Hawaii, because the population is so dramatically different. Some famous individuals, some celebrities you might recognize with that movement are Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie. And you might say, well, why does that matter? Because just like today, celebrities of their time, their opinions impacted how other people felt about it then, sorry. And then you also have some individuals who felt like we should be taking over. And so the imperialists argued the Philippines could flourish economically, which would benefit the Filipino people, and of course could potentially benefit the United States as well. Rudyard Kipling wrote what was called The White Man's Burden, and we've referenced this already in class. But what it did is it encouraged the United States to, according to Kipling, quote, civilize the Philippines. And so it was the United States' responsibility, the white man's responsibility, to civilize what Kipling deemed these backwards people. The Senate accepted this treaty and by one vote, and the Philippines were acquired on February 6, 1899. Next is Puerto Rico and Cuba. So Puerto Rico first. Puerto Rico is an interesting case study, and every year I ask for clarity on this, and every year I have to look it up, and I'm still not completely clear on it. But Puerto Rico is now owned by the U.S., but it is not a state, nor is it a territory. And even today, they vote in presidential elections, I believe. They do not pay federal taxes. And so it's a really just interesting relationship. And so part of that reason is because the Foraker Act, which was passed, gave Puerto Rico a limited elected government, so government of Puerto Rico. They also granted Puerto Ricans full U.S. citizenship in 1917, and the United States did make many improvements to Puerto Rico, improvements in sanitation, transportation, education. Again, this is something I referenced in general terms when we talked about imperialism at the beginning of this unit, and we're seeing the specific case study here with Puerto Rico. The question did emerge, though, is do American laws and the laws laid out by the U.S. Constitution extend to the new territories that the United States was acquiring? And so this was eventually challenged to the Supreme Court in a series of cases known as the Insular cases. And ultimately what the Supreme Court declared was that America's laws and customs did not necessarily extend to these new lands. And so while they might be under U.S. rule, they don't necessarily receive the same freedoms and liberties that U.S. citizens within the contiguous United States did. Lastly, looking at Cuba, the Teller Amendment, as we've already discussed, said that the United States would leave Cuba to be independent, and so the United States, in spirit, abided by that, but in reality, we were still going to be involved, and we'll see how. So the U.S. set up a military government and made many improvements up to this point in determining this. Colonel Leonard Wood, for the time after the war, was the one in charge of the island, and so we do leave, according to the Teller Amendment, in 1902, so 4 years after the conflict started and ended. We do leave the Philippines, but when we leave, we include a little piece within their constitution known as the Platt Amendment, which essentially gives gives the United States control over portions of Cuba and really kind of acts as a parent to Cuba. And so what the Platt Amendment said is that Cuba couldn't make treaties that the United States did not like. They couldn't take on too much debt. And again, that was going to be the judgment of the United States. And they must lease some bases to the United States. It started out as 2, and actually still to this day, we control Guantanamo Bay in Cuba because of the Platt Amendment passed in 1902.